Tenet was released into theaters in the middle of a pandemic, so I chose to wait until it was released for home viewing, and then completely forgot about its existence until nearly a year later. But here we are. Tenet is a spiritual successor to Inception, and though it's not a direct sequel, the use of a mind-bending sci-fi concept to create some impressive and unique action scenes is reminiscent of that film. The fight scenes have top-tier choreography and stunts, avoiding the use of CG. Tenet is the kind of film that could only be made with a huge Hollywood budget. Christopher Nolan crashes and destroys a real 747, which was surprisingly more cost-effective than it would have been with computer effects.
You want to crash a plane?
But not from the air. Not so dramatic.
I hold much respect for Nolan for working in camera, on location, and without a green screen whenever possible. Tenet is impressive from a technical perspective simply because it is such a challenging idea to present without the extensive use of CG. The premise of Tenet is explained early on. There's a secret technology to reverse an object's entropy, causing it to move backwards through time, while everything around the object is moving forward through time. Nolan actually shot some scenes twice, once regularly and once in reverse, with the actors walking or even speaking backwards, Kenneth Branagh having to read some lines backwards with a fake Russian accent.
I don't know what you're talking about.
You left it in the car, not the fire truck, right?
Interstellar was noteworthy for weaving real scientific theories into the script, but the concept in Tenet is really just a shell to build impressive action set pieces around. If the convoluted plot feels like an obstacle to your enjoyment of Tenet, then you're not alone. There are definitely questions I was asking myself during Tenet's opening scene. Who is this guy? What's this mission he's on? Now he's taking a cyanide pill, but it's a fake, and it was all a test? What is going on? This movie is way over my head! But by the time I realized it was simply a pair of secret agents chasing down a MacGuffin, my questions were more like, why is the car traveling backwards through time when only the protagonist went through the time travel device? The device is in this big room with a mirror splitting the forward-moving world and the backward-moving world. If you don't see yourself coming out of the other side of the device, then you shouldn't get in it because it means you didn't make it out on the other side. The time travel element makes enough sense in a fictional world, but how scientifically accurate could any of this be? When a car driven by the protagonist blows up, he survives because fire moving backwards through time becomes ice, and the protagonist gets hypothermia but lives. I was really doubtful that the science made sense with this one, so I looked up an interview with a physicist who said, absolutely not. As far as comprehension of the plot, it doesn't help that the sound mixing for Tenet is rather questionable. Audiences complained that the voice tracks sounded muffled and drowned out by the music, with Christopher Nolan maintaining that this was a stylistic choice. When your movie has such a high concept setup, you might want the audience to be able to understand what the characters are saying. Or maybe not, because it might just create more plot holes. Despite the lack of humanity in the characters and a clinical approach, Tenet is still beautifully shot, well acted, and directed. I even enjoyed Ludwig Göransson's over-the-top, loud and abrasive hot white noise in the musical score. At least it stood out when so many film scores disappear from my brain as soon as the movie is over. Tenet is a cyclical figure eight of a film, a loop of cause and effect, wrapped up in grandiose action presentation that, while conventional, still feels a lot more fresh than its contemporary sci-fi action. That's it for the introduction. The rest of the review will contain significant spoilers. The main character, played by John David Washington, is cheekily called the protagonist, and he doesn't get a backstory or any real character depth. It doesn't matter because it's a role that is more about physicality than line delivery. The protagonist is there to look cool as he globetrots around in search of what I will scientifically refer to as the moving backwards through time device, so that he can stop World War III from happening. Robert Pattinson is his handler and partner, Neil, a mysterious guy who the audience also knows little about. He claims to have a master's degree in theoretical physics, so his purpose is to explain the time travel concept to the protagonist and the audience. Robert Pattinson puts on the charm and has much more personality than our blank slate protagonist, though John David Washington makes up for his character's lack of complexity by excelling in the film's action scenes, which, theoretical physics aside, are the meat and potatoes of Tenet. Tenet has a slow start. There's the big opening action scene that begins with an orchestra pit tuning up. The plot doesn't really pick up until our two lead characters reverse bungee jump into a tall building to get information, and then go on a museum heist to steal a fake piece of artwork that a Russian oligarch's wife falsely authenticated and is being used to blackmail her. The movie shows that a character moving backwards through time will perceive the world around them to be moving backwards while they are moving forward. A bullet whose entropy has been reversed firing itself back into a gun is the way the film makes its sci-fi concept easy to understand for the audience. There's a scene where someone disguised in armor comes rushing through backwards and the protagonist has a fight with him. I remember thinking as this scene played out, that's probably the future version of the protagonist moving backwards through time, and now he's having a fight with himself. Later, that was revealed to be the case, and though I predicted the outcome, it was still satisfying to see the film play around with time travel in this way. Likewise, in the backwards car chase scene, it was the protagonist in the third car that he slid the briefcase across, meaning that even when he was moving forward on the timeline, his future self had already gone back and unintentionally interfered. The Russian oligarch Andrei Sater, the main antagonist, is played by Kenneth Branagh, who brings his Shakespearean chops as an over-the-top, mustache-twirling egomaniac. His character has the fate of the planet linked to his Fitbit, and if he dies, the world ends. His name is a reference to the Sater Square, which is a grouping of 5 Latin words into a complex palindrome, including the words Satyr, Arepo, Tenet, Opera, and Rotas. Satyr is the film's villain. One translation would be the divine founder. Arepo is the art dealer who painted the fake Goya that Satyr's wife, Kat, falsely authenticated. The film begins in an opera house, and Rotas is the name of the security company. Rotas, or wheels, refers to the rotating turnstile device that reverses people's entropy. Elizabeth Debicki plays Satyr's wife, Kat, who suffers at the hands of his abuse. It's a stereotypical portrayal of a male aggressor and a female victim, though it is well acted, and Kat does claim her own agency by the conclusion. There was more commentary on Elizabeth Debicki's height than her actual performance, but as our male heroes are very much mystery boxes, her character brought some much-needed humanity to the film. A temporal pincer movement is explained to be a situation where half of the squad is moving forwards through time, while the other half starts in the future and moves backwards to meet them. The characters move through time, meeting in the middle like letters in a palindrome, yet Tenet rarely gets overtly philosophical with its material, functioning mostly as a thriller with its characters existing more like cogs in a machine than real nuanced people. This reminds me of Hitchcock's approach to film. The characters in Nolan's film exist to support the high concept physics. It's not a character study by any means. In the end, it's all about chasing down an algorithm that can destroy the world. Tenet is a fresh approach to the time travel story and a reinvention of the spy subgenre. It's a film that holds up for multiple viewings as its ending explains why so little has been revealed about the protagonist. A future version of the protagonist is the one who hired Neil at some point in Neil's past, meaning the protagonist is the one in charge of the Tenet program. Michael Caine is in this movie, but he's only in one scene where he teases the protagonist for the brand of suit he's wearing. Such a British thing to do. I know Christopher Nolan and Michael Caine work well together, like in The Prestige and in the Dark Knight trilogy, but in Tenet, it feels mostly like a cameo, a nod to the spy films that inspired Tenet. Aaron Taylor-Johnson also shows up as a badass military guy named Ives. He's a better badass military guy here than he was in Godzilla 2014. Then there's this character Priya, who our heroes get some information from. These characters, like most of the characters in Tenet, function as plot devices. Though the characters are not incredibly complex, there are deeper themes that the film's story is built upon. The interplay of fate and free will is explored in the actions of the protagonist as he unknowingly progresses towards his future self. Control is also a major theme of the film, as the film's antagonist Sator is not only obsessed with control over his wife and child, but also how his fate will affect the future of the planet. Though the plot might seem overly complex upon first viewing, it starts off no more complicated than a series of video game fetch quests. Tenet opens with the opera scene where the protagonist is seeking an unknown package from an embedded agent who's been made. Shortly after, his superior Faye gives the protagonist the secret Tenet code word and hand gesture, essential for any secret agent. A phone call gives him information about a member of Tenet named Priya. Priya gives him information about the arms dealer Sator, who can communicate with the future. Michael Caine's Crosby gives him information about Sator's wife Kat, and the false Goya painted by Arepo. This is quite a lot of setup in order for the protagonist to come face to face with Sator and the turnstile technology, but this is when it gets interesting. The structure of the film's screenplay is unique, as halfway through, the protagonist and antagonist meet in a turnstile room, and several scenes that follow are scenes from earlier in the film, only now constructed in reverse. The group has to go backwards in time to heal Kat's bullet wound, then turn around and head forward in time, then invert again and head towards the final battle for the algorithm, which actually takes place on the same day as the opening opera house scene. The ending where it turns out the protagonist is the creator of Tenet, and that he essentially recruited himself, turns the film into a temporal pincer movement. I am curious about the logistic implications of this. Wouldn't a future version of the protagonist have to travel backwards in time for years with an air supply long enough to last in order to meet a past version of Neil years before the film even begins? There's even a fan theory that Kat's young son Max and Neil are the same person, yet that would be pretty far back to go. The film follows the logic that future events will play out the way they were meant to, and that going backwards in time will ultimately become the cause of the events playing out that way.
But can we change things if we do it differently?
What's happened's happened.
This can be exhibited in the scene where three versions of the protagonist collide, one from the past, one from the future inverted, and a third when the future inverted one enters a turnstile and moves forward again. The scientist in the beginning explains that cause and effect are irrelevant when traveling backwards in time, and that free will still exists because the bullet never would have fired back into the gun if the protagonist hadn't picked it up. During the final ticking clock scene of the movie, Sator is attempting to bury the algorithm so that it can be excavated in the future to invert all of time and destroy reality. Sator does this because he's been diagnosed with cancer and can't stand the idea of the world going on without him. The protagonist is trying to steal the algorithm so that it can be broken back into 9 separate pieces. The protagonist almost has the algorithm, but it's trapped behind a locked gate. A corpse by the gate is identified as Neil by the totem on his backpack. This totem also identifies Neil as the same agent who saved the protagonist in the opera house. Without seeing that this is where he will die, but sensing it anyway, Neil decides that the unlocked gate must have been a result from him traveling back in time, and decides to head back, sealing his fate. But what if he didn't? Would reality invert and cease to be? The whole premise relies on multiple timelines. If Sator in the future were to receive the algorithm and invert time, annihilating reality, he never would have lived to do so in the future because Kat kills him on the yacht during one of the earliest points in the film's timeline. The screenplay is aware of potential paradoxes in time travel storytelling and dissuades the audience from thinking about it too much.
Don't try to understand it. Feel it.
In a parallel worlds theory, we can't know the relationship between consciousness and multiple realities. Is your head hurt yet?
It's not like one needs to understand Maxwell's demon or Schrodinger's cat to enjoy Tenet. Despite its shortcomings, Tenet is one of my top films from 2020. Not that a ton of movies came out last year, but Tenet really stands out for Nolan's dedication to the craft of filmmaking, and sadly, movies with practical effects like Tenet are beginning to feel like part of a dying breed. When you type Tenet into Google, people ask questions like, is Tenet the worst movie ever? I'm here to tell you, no, it's not. And there's a Travis Scott song during the end credits, so that's a plus.